The wind cut through the early morning like a blade, howling through the train station's steel beams. Commuters rushed past in thick coats, their faces buried in scarves, eager to escape the biting cold. But amidst the moving crowd, one figure remained still. A German shepherd, his fur dusted with frost, his body tense but unwavering. Rocky sat near the platform edge, his amber eyes locked onto the arriving train. He didn't shiver. He didn't beg. He simply waited, watching as if expecting someone to step off that train, as if this moment was all that mattered. People walked past, some sparing him a glance, others merely stepping around him as though he were part of the station itself. A child tugged at her mother's sleeve, pointing at the lone dog, but they hurried on without stopping. A few passengers sighed in pity. Others shook their heads and muttered about stray dogs. But Rocky didn't move, didn't acknowledge their presence. His silent determination remained unshaken. From the security booth near the entrance, Daniel watched. He had noticed Rocky weeks ago, sitting in the same spot, staring at the same train every single morning. The dog never barked, never begged for food, never approached anyone. He simply waited. And something about that unwavering patience gnawed at Daniel. Maybe it was the way Rocky's ears perked up at every approaching train, the way his tail would twitch with anticipation, only for his body to sag when no one arrived. It was a routine that felt all too familiar. Daniel's life had become a cycle of silent suffering. Wake up, work, return home to an empty apartment. Grief clung to him, wrapped around him like the winter cold. His wife had been gone for 2 years now, but the weight of her absence never faded. And yet, somehow, in the quiet stillness of that dog's watchful waiting, he saw his own reflection. One morning, as Daniel made his usual rounds, his gaze met Rocky's. For the first time, the dog looked back, not just a glance, but a deep, searching stare. His amber eyes held stories, unspoken words, a silent plea. In them, Daniel saw something raw and aching. A question, a hope, a loneliness that mirrored his own. As the days passed, Daniel found himself pausing more often, studying Rocky's steadfast vigil. The question whispered at the back of his mind. Who was he waiting for? The answer was a mystery, buried in time, but one thing was clear. Rocky wasn't just another stray. He belonged to someone, and that someone had never come back. The distant hum of the train fades into the night, leaving only the occasional rustle of wind through the empty station. Daniel stands near the platform's edge, hands buried deep in his jacket pockets. His shift is over, yet he lingers, eyes drifting to the lone figure curled up near the bench, Rocky. The dog doesn't stir. His gaze remains locked on the tracks, ears perked, as if waiting for something or someone. A gust of cold wind sweeps through the station, but Rocky doesn't flinch. His focus never wavers, his silent vigil unbroken. Daniel exhales, his breath visible in the icy air. He had seen dogs abandoned before, strays roaming the city, scavenging for scraps, but Rocky was different. He didn't beg, didn't chase after food or attention. He simply waited. And that waiting felt endless. Have you ever wondered about that dog? Daniel asks, breaking the quiet as he stops by a small food stall near the exit. The vendor, an older man with a thick scarf wrapped around his neck, follows Daniel's gaze. Rocky? Yeah, been coming here for years. He wipes his hands on a rag, shaking his head. Always at the same time, always to that same spot, like clockwork. Daniel frowns. Waiting for someone? The vendor sighs. That's the thing. No one ever comes. People used to say he belonged to someone. But if that's true, that person ain't been here for a long time. Daniel glances back at Rocky, whose tired eyes remain fixed on the empty tracks. The thought lingers in his mind. What keeps a dog waiting this long? Daniel had spent years in the military, and if there was one thing he had learned, it was to trust his gut. He had seen this look before, on the faces of men who had lost everything but refused to move forward. He leans against a pillar, watching. The world moves around Rocky, people come and go, but the dog remains still, his patience unwavering. Daniel sees something in him, grief, a deep, quiet sorrow buried beneath years of waiting. Why? That question gnaws at him, refusing to let go. There's something here, something worth knowing. That evening, just before heading home, Daniel stops by the convenience store. He picks up a small packet of food, nothing fancy, just something to test a theory. Back at the station, Rocky hasn't moved. Daniel walks past, crouching down a few feet away, placing the meal on the ground. He doesn't speak, doesn't try to coax the dog over. Instead, he simply stands and walks away, giving Rocky space. Minutes later, as he watches from a distance, the dog rises, stepping cautiously toward the food. He sniffs, hesitates, then eats. But there's no wagging tail, no grateful glance, just silent acceptance before Rocky resumes his place near the tracks. It isn't trust, not yet, but it's something. The wind picks up that night, carrying the sharp sting of an approaching storm. Rain begins to fall, slow at first, then faster, turning into a relentless downpour. Daniel pulls his hood up, ready to leave, until he sees Rocky. The dog trembles, soaked from head to paw, but he doesn't move from his spot. He just sits there, ears drooping, body shaking. Daniel curses under his breath. Stubborn dog. Lightning flashes across the sky, followed by the crack of thunder. Still, Rocky doesn't budge. A sharp pang twists in Daniel's chest. He had seen men like this before, men who would rather suffer in silence than admit they needed help. He had been one of them once. Daniel exhales, then steps forward, kneeling just a few feet away from Rocky. He reaches out a hand, palm facing up, keeping his voice steady. "Come on, buddy. You're gonna freeze out here." Rocky doesn't react at first. His ears twitch, his body stiffens, but he doesn't run. He just watches Daniel, watching him the way a soldier sizes up an unfamiliar face in enemy territory. Seconds pass, then a minute. Then finally, Rocky takes a single step forward. Just one. Daniel doesn't move, doesn't breathe. The dog stops, hesitant, but closer than before. Close enough that Daniel can see the exhaustion in his eyes, the weight of years spent waiting. "Good boy," Daniel murmurs, voice barely above a whisper. For the first time, Rocky doesn't look at the tracks. He looks at Daniel. And in that quiet moment, something shifts. Daniel approached the station as the last echoes of the departing train faded into the night. His footsteps slowed near the platform's edge, where Rocky sat, still as a statue, eyes fixed on the tracks. "Evening, buddy," Daniel murmured, placing a small container of food a few feet away. His voice was low, gentle, careful not to startle the dog. Rocky's ears flicked, but he didn't move. Not yet. The hunger was there, visible in the slight tension of his body, but so was caution. He waited. Only when Daniel stepped back far enough to reassure him did he inch forward and begin to eat. Daniel watched in silence. Each night was the same. Rocky would eat, but his eyes never strayed from the rails, as if expecting someone to appear from the shadows. Daniel sighed, tucking his hands into his pockets. "Who are you waiting for?" he whispered, already knowing Rocky wouldn't answer. One night, after leaving Rocky's meal behind, Daniel started his walk home. The night air was crisp, his breath visible under the streetlights. A few blocks in, a strange feeling crept over him, the sense of being followed. He glanced back. Rocky was there, a few paces behind, keeping his distance but never losing sight of him. Daniel slowed, half expecting the dog to bolt, but Rocky merely stopped, his eyes calm but watchful. "You coming along, huh?" Daniel mused. He didn't approach, didn't push. He simply walked on. Rocky followed, not too close, never too far. Just enough to feel present. The next evening, as Daniel placed the meal down, he spoke without thinking. "Rocky." The dog didn't react. He ate as he always did, cautious, methodical. "Rocky." Daniel tried again, softer this time, testing the weight of the name in the air. It suited him, strong yet weathered, like something that had endured far more than it should have. For days, there was no response, but Daniel kept saying it, letting it settle into the space between them. Then, one evening, as Daniel sat on the cold bench beside him, Rocky turned his head ever so slightly at the sound of his name. It wasn't much, but it was something. A week later, while Daniel sipped coffee at a small kiosk near the station, an old man, wrapped in layers against the cold, watched Rocky with knowing eyes. "You've taken a liking to him, huh?" the man asked, his voice rough with age. Daniel nodded. "Seems like he's been here forever." The man chuckled, shaking his head. "Feels that way, but he wasn't always alone." Daniel straightened, intrigued. "You know his story." The man sighed, rubbing his hands together. "Not all of it, but I remember the boy he used to wait for." The words settled in Daniel's chest like a weight. "His owner?" Daniel asked, his voice quieter now. The old man nodded. "Aaron. Used to come through this station every day. That dog, he was his shadow. Couldn't separate the two if you tried." Daniel watched Rocky, who sat unmoving at the edge of the platform, his eyes still locked on the tracks. What happened? The man hesitated, as if the past had lost its sharpness but not its sorrow. One night, the kid never came back. Daniel barely breathed as the old man continued. An accident, hit and run. He was on his way home, same as always. But that night, fate had other plans. The words struck deep. Daniel swallowed, glancing at Rocky. "He's been waiting ever since," the old man said, shaking his head. "Same time, same place. As if he believes Aaron's still out there, trying to find his way back." Daniel exhaled slowly. He looked at Rocky again, not just at him, but through him. Past the wiry fur and the guarded stance, into something deeper. Grief. Hope. A devotion that refused to break. That night, as Daniel sat beside Rocky on the cold platform, a strange ache settled in his chest. He had spent years running from his own ghosts, refusing to look back. And yet, here was this dog, refusing to move forward, anchored by love that defied logic. "You don't believe he's gone, do you?" Daniel murmured, voice thick. Rocky's ears flicked at the sound, but he didn't turn. Daniel rubbed his face, the weight of loss settling deep. "I get it," he admitted. "I know what it's like to wait for someone who's never coming back." For the first time, Rocky's head shifted slightly in Daniel's direction. Not fully, but enough. Enough to be understood. That night, the air was colder than usual. The wind cut through Daniel's coat as he extended his hand toward Rocky. For a long time, nothing happened. Then, Rocky hesitated, his muscles tensed as if fighting some unseen battle. And finally, slowly, carefully, he leaned in. His nose brushed Daniel's palm, warm and fleeting. A heartbeat later, he pulled back, but the moment had already happened. The wall between them had cracked just enough to let something in, something like trust. For the first time, Daniel did something different. He stood and patted his leg. "Come on, Rocky, just for tonight." Rocky hesitated, glancing back at the tracks, then at Daniel. A long moment passed, and then he followed. Not beside him, not close enough to call it trust, but close enough to call it hope. By dawn, Rocky was gone, back at his usual post. But Daniel wasn't discouraged, because now Rocky knew something. He had a place to go, should he ever decide to. Days turned into weeks. The visits continued. The meals remained. The space between them grew smaller, little by little. And Daniel, for the first time in years, felt something shift inside him. He had started this journey thinking he was offering Rocky comfort. But maybe, just maybe, Rocky was offering him the same. The low murmur of city officials reached Daniel's ears as he passed through the station. He wasn't one to eavesdrop, but the words stopped him in his tracks. Renovations, demolitions, no more loitering. The station was getting a facelift. New floors, better security, no stray animals. Daniel's heart clenched. Rocky's world was about to collapse, and he didn't even know it. That evening, Daniel stood at his usual spot, watching Rocky curled up beside the rusting bench. The dog's chest rose and fell in steady rhythm, the flickering station light casting a soft glow over his worn fur. He looked peaceful, blissfully unaware that soon there would be no station left for him to wait in. No familiar tracks, no comforting routine. Daniel sighed. How do you take away hope from someone who only lives for it? Rocky could sense it, the shift in the air, the unease in the voices around him. The station smelled different now, metal, paint, machines. Fewer of the regular commuters stopped by. More strangers in reflective vests walked past him, barely sparing him a glance. His spot near the bench was shrinking. Wooden barriers blocked parts of the platform. Some days, his paws met cold metal instead of the warmth of his usual resting place. The station was changing, and it unsettled him. But one thing hadn't changed. The trains. They still arrived, doors hissing open, figures stepping out. And so Rocky kept searching. Each time the train screeched to a halt, he perked up. He sniffed the air, he watched, and when the doors opened, he ran, his paws skidding against the concrete as he pushed through the crowd, searching. But Aaron was never there. Yet Rocky never gave up. One night, his desperation almost cost him his life. The train's whistle shrieked, and before Daniel could react, Rocky bolted straight toward the tracks. His tail was raised, his ears forward. He must have seen someone, thought he saw someone. The headlights bore down on him. "Rocky!" Daniel lunged, grabbing the scruff of Rocky's neck just in time. The force knocked them both backward as the train roared past, sending a gust of wind against their bodies. Daniel's heart pounded. Rocky's legs trembled beneath him. But the dog's eyes stayed fixed on the train as it disappeared into the distance. Still searching, still hoping. Daniel swallowed hard. How much longer can he keep waiting? Daniel sat on the platform that night. Rocky curled beside him. His fingers absently stroked the dog's fur, but his mind was racing. If Rocky stayed, he would lose his home. If he took him away, he'd be tearing him from the only thing keeping him alive. But what kind of life was this? Living in a ghost of the past, waiting for someone who would never come. Daniel clenched his jaw. He understood Rocky's pain better than he wanted to admit. He had once waited, too. Waited for someone he lost, unable to move forward, drowning in memories. But Rocky deserved more than this. He deserved warmth, comfort, a home. He just didn't know if the dog would ever accept it. The rain poured hard that night, drenching the empty station. Daniel found Rocky lying near the entrance, shivering. His fur was soaked, his body curled into itself. He wasn't waiting at the tracks anymore. He was exhausted. Daniel knelt beside him, pulling off his coat to drape over Rocky's trembling form. "Rocky," Daniel whispered, his voice breaking. He held the dog close, his warmth bleeding into the shivering body beneath his hands. "Aaron wouldn't want you to suffer anymore." For the first time, Rocky didn't pull away. For the first time, he leaned into Daniel's touch. The next morning, Daniel drove to a quiet cemetery at the edge of town. Rocky sat beside him in the passenger seat, silent, his dark eyes heavy with something Daniel had never seen before. Understanding. They stopped at a modest headstone, slightly weathered but well kept. Aaron Michaels. Daniel sat on the damp grass, watching as Rocky slowly stepped forward. The dog sniffed the stone, his nose tracing the carved letters. Then, as if something deep inside him finally settled, he let out a soft sigh and lay down, resting his head against the grave. Daniel's throat tightened. He reached out, running a gentle hand over Rocky's back. "Come home with me," he murmured. Rocky didn't move, but he didn't pull away either. Rocky no longer lingers by the rusting tracks, where the echoes of departing trains once held his unwavering hope. The spot where he had spent endless days, scanning every arriving passenger for a face that would never return, is now abandoned. Instead, he follows Daniel without hesitation, his paws falling in rhythm with the older man's steady steps. The waiting is over. Each morning, Rocky walks beside Daniel, not toward the station, but through the quiet streets of the neighborhood, where the scent of fresh bread drifts from a nearby bakery, and children laugh in the distance. There is no more frantic searching, no more desperate glances at the train schedule. This is his new path, one that leads not to heartbreak, but to a life where he is wanted. Daniel places a soft, well-worn blanket in the corner of his living room, next to the fireplace. "This is yours now," he murmurs, patting the space. Rocky circles once, then curls up, sighing deeply. For the first time in years, he is not a stray looking for shelter. He is home. For so long, Daniel's house had been filled with silence, an emptiness that had settled after his wife passed. He had grown used to it, the quiet becoming a dull ache he no longer questioned. But now, there is movement. The soft patter of paws, the gentle signs of a dreaming dog. The silence remains, but it no longer feels so heavy. Grief does not vanish overnight, and neither does loneliness. But as Daniel watches Rocky chase a drifting autumn leaf, ears perked in delight, he feels something shift within him. The weight of the past is still there, but it's no longer unbearable. Rocky's presence is not just a distraction, it's a comfort, a reminder that moving forward doesn't mean forgetting. Mornings used to feel meaningless, just another stretch of hours to get through. But now, Daniel has a reason to rise early. There's food to prepare, walks to take, a companion waiting eagerly by the door. In caring for Rocky, Daniel realizes he has been given something precious in return: purpose. Rocky still waits, but not by the station. Now, he waits at the door for Daniel to put on his coat, his tail wagging in anticipation of their daily stroll. He no longer searches for someone who will never return. His waiting is different now, softer, filled with certainty instead of loss. The evening sky is painted in soft hues of gold and lavender as Daniel settles onto his porch, Rocky at his feet. He strokes the dog's fur absent-mindedly, watching the sun dip below the horizon. No words are spoken, none are needed. In this quiet moment there is no longing, no sorrow, only peace. Rocky shifts closer, resting his head on Daniel's lap. The old man lets out a quiet chuckle, his fingers threading through Rocky's fur. There is no more searching, no more aching anticipation. For the first time in years, Rocky is not waiting for something that will never come. He is exactly where he belongs. Rocky's devotion never faltered. Through every passing day, through every empty night, he had remained by Aaron's side, even in his absence. Loyalty, pure and unwavering, had been his guiding force. And now that same loyalty bound him to Daniel, not out of duty, but out of love. Love does not vanish with loss. It lingers, like a familiar scent in the air, like a whisper in the wind. Rocky had waited, believing Aaron would return. But even in Aaron's absence, his love remained, transforming, evolving, finding new purpose in the warmth of Daniel's presence. Just as Rocky had to let go of the station, of the waiting, Daniel had to release the weight of his grief. The past would always be a part of them, but it could not define them. Letting go didn't mean forgetting, it meant making space for something new. Healing wasn't about erasing pain, it was about finding light in the darkness, about learning to carry love forward. In each other, Daniel and Rocky discovered that healing was not a solitary journey. It was a path walked side by side, paw in hand. Neither of them had been looking for this. Daniel hadn't planned to let anyone in again. Rocky had believed his purpose ended with Aaron. But love has a way of creeping in, of finding cracks in even the hardest hearts, mending them in ways unseen. Rocky had found a home. Daniel had found a reason to wake up in the morning. They weren't searching for each other, but perhaps, just perhaps, they had been meant to find one another all along.